Think your recent lockdown experience was rough? Try surviving the Black Death, where panicked governments and clueless doctors wrote the ultimate rulebook of absolute madness. Facing the deadliest crisis in human history, authorities passed laws so incredibly bizarre they defy all logic. Today, we are exposing the wildest, most chaotic quarantine regulations everyday citizens were forced to endure. Let the medieval madness begin. 1. If you think staying home for a few weeks is tough, try 17th century London. The moment a single person in your house showed symptoms of the plague, government officials didn't just ask you to isolate. They physically locked your entire family inside, nailed the front door shut from the outside, and painted a massive red cross on the wood with the words, "Lord have mercy on us." You were legally trapped with the infected for 40 days. 2. In a spectacular display of medieval problem-solving, authorities decided that cats and dogs were spreading the disease. The logical rule? A total ban on city pets. Thousands of animals were rounded up and removed by official orders. Here is the beautifully ironic tragedy. By eliminating the cats, they completely removed the natural predators of the actual culprits. The rat population absolutely skyrocketed, carrying the real problem right into everyone's homes. They practically invited the plague inside, all while blaming the local golden retrievers. 3. Before you could even think about traveling between Italian city-states in the 16th century, you needed a fedi. This was a mandatory health passport, a stamped government document proving you came from a plague-free zone. If you tried to cross a border without one, or worse, if you forged it, the punishment wasn't a fine or community service. It was immediate execution. Bureaucracy was so strict that people were literally risking the gallows just to go visit their cousins in the next town over. 4. In a dramatic display of total desperation, town guards were sometimes ordered to literally fight the sky. Archers were commanded to assemble in the main square and shoot hundreds of arrows directly into the dark clouds. The bizarre military logic suggested that sharp arrows would physically pierce the thick poisoned air and allow the healthy atmosphere to flow back in. Citizens cheered as soldiers wasted their precious ammunition attacking the weather. It was a spectacular, theatrical distraction that did absolutely zero to stop the silent, invisible killer. 5. Hygiene rules got incredibly weird and completely reversed. Taking a hot bath was strictly discouraged, and in some places outright banned during outbreaks. Medical experts of the era confidently declared that warm water opened the pores on your skin, allowing the deadly plague air to casually drift right into your body. Because of this bizarre regulation, people deliberately went months without washing, genuinely believing that a thick layer of natural grime acted like a protective armor against the bacterial infection. 6. Drinking crushed gold was an exclusive medical treatment reserved solely for the ultra-wealthy. Physicians prescribed expensive tonics made from pulverized emeralds, pearls, and pure gold flakes, believing that such precious materials naturally possessed divine healing properties. Rich patients eagerly drank these heavy metal smoothies, which did absolutely nothing to cure the bacteria, but likely gave them severe internal lacerations. The elite literally tried to buy their way out of death by consuming their own jewelry, proving money cannot buy common sense. 7. Funeral regulations completely erased human empathy. In many European cities, traditional mourning was heavily criminalized. You were legally forbidden from ringing church bells for the deceased, holding gatherings, or even crying too loudly in the streets. The core logic was that profound sadness and the sound of tolling bells weakened the immune system and somehow disturbed the air. If you lost a loved one, you were officially expected to just keep a stiff upper lip and stay absolutely quiet. Dealing with grief was literally treated as a public health hazard. 8. Economic transactions became incredibly paranoid. If you wanted to buy groceries at the local market, you couldn't just hand over your coins. A strict municipal rule required all money to be submerged in a bowl of vinegar before the merchant would even touch it. They believed the acidic vinegar purged the disease from the metal. It was the medieval equivalent of wiping down your groceries with bleach, leaving the entire local economy smelling like a giant metallic salad dressing. 9. The local fashion police took on a whole new meaning. Italian magistrates actually passed strict laws banning women from wearing luxurious clothes, expensive lace, or excessive jewelry during the pandemic. The reasoning had absolutely nothing to do with hygiene. They genuinely believed the Black Death was a direct punishment from God for human vanity. By outlawing fancy dresses, they figured they could appease the divine wrath. Do you really think giving up your best outfit would be enough to stop a microscopic bacterial apocalypse? 10. Plague doctors had their own absurd set of workplace regulations. Those iconic, terrifying bird masks weren't just for looking incredibly intimidating. The rules required doctors to stuff the beak with highly fragrant herbs, spices, and rose petals to filter the deadly air. More importantly, they were legally forbidden from actually touching the patients with their bare hands. They were issued long wooden pointers, which they used to poke, prod, and examine the dying from a safe distance, making medical exams look like a very grim game of billiards. 11. Once a household was cleared of the infection, survivors were finally allowed outside. But there was a deeply humiliating catch. European town laws forced anyone associated with a quarantined house to carry a 3-foot-long white wooden wand everywhere they walked. It acted like a medieval hazard light. If you were caught walking to the market without your highly visible plague stick, you faced severe fines or even jail time. The entire town would literally part like the Red Sea the second they saw you coming down the street, treating you like a walking ghost. 12. Stepping outside after sunset transformed you into a suspected criminal. Severe municipal curfews were enacted, forcing every citizen to lock their doors the moment the sun went down. The scientific consensus of the era declared that the night air was incredibly dense and carried the highest concentration of deadly miasma. If the night watch caught you walking around in the dark, they assumed you were actively trying to infect the neighborhood. You would be immediately arrested, locked in a cell, and forced to face the incredibly angry local magistrate by sunrise. 13. Choking on thick wood smoke was an inescapable daily reality. City councils passed aggressive ordinances requiring massive bonfires to be built on literally every single street corner. You were legally mandated to keep these fires burning relentlessly, day and night. The medical consensus claimed intense heat would purify the infected air floating through the city. Instead of stopping the bacteria, this rule just gave everyone severe respiratory issues while they tried to walk to the local bakery. Imagine fighting a deadly disease while breathing constant smog. 14. Magistrates in Milan ruthlessly banned all gambling and tavern drinking during the 1576 outbreak. This had absolutely nothing to do with social distancing. Authorities genuinely believed that drunk, swearing gamblers directly provoked God's wrath, which in turn kept the pandemic alive. If you wanted a quiet pint of ale, you risked the local guards kicking your door down. Your secret evening card game was legally viewed as a supernatural threat to the entire city. Forget about unwinding after a stressful day. Having fun was officially treated as a public crime. 15. Venice completely removed you from society if you sneezed the wrong way. Authorities forcibly shipped symptomatic citizens off to a lazaretto, an isolated island specifically built for the infected. It was a one-way ticket to a crowded, chaotic nightmare where the somewhat healthy and the dying were tossed together. You essentially became an exile in your own city. Families were ripped apart by guards, and the healthy were left wondering if they would ever see their loved ones again. The government basically turned a nearby island into a permanent waiting room. 16. Secondhand shopping was aggressively criminalized. Tailors and cobblers were strictly forbidden from repairing, buying, or selling old clothes and shoes. City officials surprisingly got something right, suspecting that used fabrics somehow harbored the deadly disease. However, their logic was slightly off. They blamed trapped poisonous air hiding in the cloth, rather than the infected rat fleas actually nesting inside the seams of old coats. By outlawing thrift shopping, they accidentally managed to cut off a major highway for the microscopic transmission. 17. Florence launched an all-out government-sanctioned crackdown on wandering farm animals. Stray pigs took the hardest hit from the new municipal rules. The authorities decreed that any swine found loose in the streets could be immediately confiscated on the spot by absolutely anyone who happened to see it. Even better, the finder got to keep the animal as a reward. This bizarre mandate turned the terrified city into a chaotic, free-for-all agricultural treasure hunt. It was the medieval equivalent of winning a bizarre municipal lottery just for taking a daily walk. 18. Surviving the sickness often meant losing absolutely everything you owned. When a household quarantine finally ended, officials did not just quickly sanitize the rooms. Town guards legally dragged every single piece of furniture, clothing, and bedding out into the street and set it entirely on fire. They destroyed family heirlooms, winter coats, and irreplaceable items, leaving the traumatized survivors completely destitute. The government essentially rewarded you for miraculously beating the deadliest disease in history by intentionally burning your life to ashes. 19. Cleanliness reached absolute paranoia levels inside many households. Government decrees strongly advise citizens to sweep away all cobwebs and thoroughly wash their floors with expensive rose water and vinegar every single day. Interestingly, this accidental deep cleaning probably helped eliminate spider habitats and reduced indoor bugs. However, it did absolutely nothing to stop the rat fleas actually causing the nightmare. People were aggressively scrubbing their baseboards while the real invisible enemy just calmly hopped around the room completely unaffected. 20. Running away to the peaceful countryside was a brilliant survival tactic, but only if your bank account was large enough. Poor citizens were legally forbidden from leaving city walls. Armed guards were stationed at the gates to keep the working class inside, ensuring the economy functioned and the dead were buried. Meanwhile, wealthy nobles and politicians simply wrote themselves official travel passes and comfortably vacationed at their sprawling country estates until the horror finally blew over. Does that kind of double standard sound a little too familiar to you? 21. Watch your mouth because foul language could literally bankrupt you. Swearing out loud in the streets of Italian cities was severely criminalized during peak outbreaks. Magistrates heavily fined anyone caught cursing, firmly convinced that using bad words was a fast track to further divine punishment. The government believed the plague was a spiritual test, and dropping a few choice words after stubbing your toe was apparently enough to doom the entire neighborhood. Imagine getting a massive ticket just for expressing your frustration about the actual apocalypse. 22. Physicians strongly recommended a very specific, incredibly bizarre accessory for anyone feeling unwell. You were officially advised to strap a dried toad around your neck. This wasn't some underground folk remedy. It was mainstream medical science. Doctors genuinely believed the porous skin of the toad would actively absorb the invisible, poisonous vapors directly from your system. According to the health rulebook, you just had to wear your little amphibian pendant until it supposedly pulled the bad air away. Medical fashion certainly had a very weird phase. 23. William Shakespeare actually wrote some of his absolute greatest plays while completely unemployed. During severe plague outbreaks, London authorities ruthlessly shut down all theaters, bear-baiting rings, and public entertainment venues by law. The official reasoning correctly noted that massive crowds, sharing breath and sweat, created a toxic soup of disease. This strict rule completely devastated the 16th century gig economy, leaving actors and playwrights jobless for months. Binge-watching shows at home wasn't exactly an option without electricity. 24. Bartenders had to get incredibly creative to stay in business legally. Since handing a customer a drink was strictly forbidden due to proximity laws, taverns adopted a hilarious workaround. Bartenders were legally required to use massive, comically long wooden paddles or baking shovels to slide a pint of ale across the room to a patron. You had to carefully grab your drink off a 6-foot plank, while the tavern owner stood securely on the other side of the room. It basically turned a casual Friday night pub visit into an incredibly awkward game of giant chess. 25. Walking down the street required a ridiculous amount of lung capacity. Official government health pamphlets literally instructed citizens to completely hold their breath whenever they crossed a bridge, walked through a narrow alley, or passed a stranger. The theory was that if you weren't actively inhaling, the invisible sickness couldn't possibly enter your body. People were sprinting across the cobblestones, turning completely red in the face, just trying to make it to the bakery without breathing. 26. Tossing regular cheap firewood into your hearth wasn't nearly enough to satisfy the paranoid health authorities. Citizens were legally required to burn highly expensive, aromatic woods like juniper, ash, and rosemary in their fireplaces. The goal was to constantly fumigate your living room and overpower the deadly miasma floating outside. This wealthy health mandate practically bankrupted normal families who just wanted to stay warm. The entire city ended up smelling like a giant, overly aggressive Yankee Candle, while citizens quietly starved paying for wood. 27. If your family member tragically passed away during a household lockdown, you couldn't just carry them outside. Watchmen stationed on the street absolutely refused to open the nailed-shut doors. You legally had to wait for the official removal carts to arrive on their own schedule. This strict rule meant grieving survivors were frequently trapped for days in tiny, suffocating rooms alongside the deceased. The psychological toll of waiting in the dark with a lost loved one was honestly just as terrifying as the very real possibility of catching the illness. 28. Hugging your neighbor became a serious legal offense. In cities like Naples, magistrates strictly banned all traditional physical greetings. Shaking hands, kissing cheeks, and even close whispering were completely outlawed in the streets. You had to maintain a rigid physical distance and wave awkwardly from completely across the piazza. For a deeply tactile, expressive society, this sudden ban on human connection felt completely unnatural and isolating. 29. Doing your weekly laundry became a heavily criminalized act in major cities. Strict laws completely banned citizens from washing infected clothing or bedding in the local rivers. While this sounds like brilliant hygiene, their reasoning was completely backwards. They didn't understand waterborne bacteria. They just believed the corrupted fabric would somehow poison the air hovering directly above the riverbanks. Violators caught scrubbing their sheets in the water were subjected to massive fines, forcing people to just wear their filthy clothes for months on end. 30. The town of Edinburgh practically turned casual dog walking into a major capital offense. If your dog was caught wandering the cobblestone streets without a leash during a quarantine, the council didn't just quietly put the animal down. The owner was held fully legally responsible for the breach. You could be severely fined, publicly shamed in the town square, or even permanently banished from the city entirely. Would you have risked total exile from your home and community just to ensure your beloved pet got their much-needed afternoon walk around the block? 31. The black market for mythical creatures absolutely exploded. Elite physicians actually prescribed powdered alicorn, which they confidently claimed was ground-up unicorn horn. It was officially endorsed as the absolute ultimate shield against the plague. In reality, desperate nobles were paying astronomical prices for crushed narwhal tusks smuggled in by opportunistic sailors. Society's top medical experts completely ignored basic hygiene, yet they fully believed a magical horse could save them from an apocalypse. Panic truly makes people buy the wildest things. 32. Carrying a pomander wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a heavily enforced safety guideline. Magistrates encouraged wealthy citizens to carry these metal spheres filled with expensive spices, ambergris, and perfumes. You were instructed to hold it directly to your nose whenever you walked past a suspicious-smelling alleyway. If you were poor, the government advised you to just carry a hollowed-out apple stuffed with cheap herbs. Essentially, society tried to battle a catastrophic bacterial infection using the medieval equivalent of a car air freshener. 33. Fast walking was aggressively frowned upon and sometimes officially prohibited by local watchmen. The medical theory of the time warned that running or moving too quickly would cause you to inhale a much larger volume of the corrupted air. Furthermore, sweating was believed to open your pores, practically inviting the deadly sickness inside. To comply with these public health mandates, citizens were forced to move through the streets in a terrifyingly slow, synchronized crawl. 34. While the ringing of church bells was banned for causing dangerous emotional distress, firing military cannons was somehow highly encouraged. City officials ordered cannons to be shot off in the center of town, completely without warning. They believed the massive sonic boom and the heavy scent of gunpowder would physically shatter the infected air and purify the atmosphere. So you were trapped inside your house, starving, terrified, and randomly subjected to deafening artillery fire just down the street. It was practically a sensory deprivation nightmare. 35. In a desperate attempt to stop the spread, the city of Pistoia in Italy passed a strict law banning the consumption of most local produce. Citizens were legally forbidden from eating specific fruits, including melons and figs, and they weren't allowed to import any poultry or meat from outside the city limits. The authorities were convinced these foods practically acted as magnets for bad air. Imagine facing the most terrifying pandemic in history, and the government tells you a melon is your absolute biggest enemy. 36. Opening your mail required serious tactical gear. If a letter arrived from a quarantined city, postal workers weren't allowed to just hand it over. Local regulations demanded that all paper correspondence be heavily smoked over a fire and then aggressively stabbed with metal tongs several times. Authorities genuinely believed they needed to poke physical holes in the paper to let the trapped plague air escape before anyone read it. Imagine getting a love letter that smells entirely like an ash pit and looks like it survived a violent encounter with a medieval sword. 37. Cut onions were placed strategically in every corner of the house to act as natural disease sponges. Government health leaflets instructed citizens to slice open raw onions and leave them rotting on the floorboards for days. The theory was that the pungent vegetable would aggressively absorb the airborne plague toxins. Once the onion turned completely black, you threw it away, assuming it was full of the deadly sickness. It just meant everyone's home smelled like a decaying salad bar, masking the true scent of the microscopic horror creeping under the doors. 38. Fleeing the city was a luxury for the rich, but actual medical professionals were strictly forbidden from leaving. Many Italian towns passed desperate laws trapping their physicians inside the city walls. If a doctor attempted to sneak out to save his own life, he could be stripped of his medical license, heavily fined, or even executed for treason against public health. The authorities basically held the only people who knew anything about medicine hostage. It is a chilling reminder of how completely ruthless governments become when society starts collapsing. 39. Dietary restrictions became incredibly bizarre and deeply specific. Local health boards explicitly banned the consumption of fish, claiming its cold and moist nature perfectly matched the plague's energy. On the flip side, citizens were practically forced to eat massive quantities of garlic and heavy meats to heat up their blood. You could get into serious legal trouble with the local magistrates just for serving a nice trout for dinner. The government was micromanaging dinner plates while half the population was being dragged away in wooden carts constantly. 40. Leather workers and tanners were heavily monitored because officials noticed they rarely caught the plague. Instead of realizing that the horrible-smelling tanning chemicals naturally repelled infected fleas, authorities assumed the awful stench of the leather vats was acting as a magical anti-miasma force field. Suddenly, everyone wanted to hang out near the incredibly toxic tanning pits. People were literally seeking out the most sickening industrial zones in the city just to take deep breaths of chemical fumes, totally misunderstanding the actual science. 41. Wearing black mourning clothes was officially outlawed in several French and Italian cities. Authorities feared that seeing hundreds of grieving people dressed in dark robes walking the streets would destroy public morale and spread terrifying melancholy. They genuinely believed that feeling depressed physically weakened the body's natural defenses, inviting the deadly bacteria in. You were legally required to wear bright, normal colors immediately after burying your entire family. Could you force a cheerful smile while the world around you completely burned? 42. Taking a midday nap became a dangerous violation of official health advice. Prominent physicians strongly warned against sleeping during the daytime, arguing that the body's natural heat retreated inward when you rested, leaving your skin cold and highly vulnerable to the poisonous air. Citizens forced themselves to stay awake for days, drinking awful herbal concoctions to fight off exhaustion. Sleep deprivation obviously completely destroyed their immune systems, meaning this widely enforced rule actually helped the Grim Reaper work much faster and easier. 43. Since burial workers were in incredibly high demand, many started price gouging desperate, grieving families. To stop this morbid inflation, city councils enacted strict wage caps. If a worker demanded a single coin over the legal limit, they could be thrown into the very same plague pits they were digging. The government essentially created a brutal union dispute right in the middle of a catastrophic biological disaster. 44. After mercilessly wiping out the cats, some towns tried to replace them with completely useless animals. Medical texts suggested keeping an owl or a goat inside the house, theorizing their unique breath would neutralize the toxic atmosphere. People were trading away their life savings for random farm animals to keep in their bedrooms. While the rats continued to multiply and spread the deadly fleas, citizens were busy feeding mice to their newly purchased indoor owls. It highlights perfectly how panic makes otherwise rational people abandon all common sense. 45. Even the local bakeries were subjected to strict, supernatural regulations. Bakers were ordered by municipal decree to mix specific medicinal herbs and bitter seeds into every loaf of bread sold to the public. They believed consuming these harsh plants daily would fortify the stomach against the creeping invisible poison. The result was rock-hard, terrible-tasting bread that essentially acted as mandatory medicine. Imagine going to the store for a fresh baguette and getting a loaf that tasted entirely like crushed pine needles and desperate medical anxiety. 46. Some villages bypassed the home lockdown rule by utilizing brutal, forced evictions. If a family member fell ill, the local militia didn't board up the door. They violently threw the infected person out of the town entirely. Patients were dragged into the nearby forests and left in makeshift wooden huts with a tiny jug of water. They were strictly forbidden from returning unless they miraculously survived the infection on their own. 47. Living in a house with a southern view was suddenly a massive liability. Public health manuals legally instructed citizens to permanently seal any windows facing south. Medical experts were absolutely convinced that the hot, humid winds blowing from the south physically carried the deadly miasma directly into the city. People spent entire summers sweltering in the dark, nailing heavy wooden boards over their beautiful windows. They were essentially turning their own homes into suffocating ovens just to hide from a gentle, warm breeze that posed no actual threat. 48. Many local governments passed aggressive laws strictly prohibiting anyone from bathing in nearby rivers or lakes. Medical experts argued that cold water violently shocked the nervous system and instantly opened the body to dangerous atmospheric poisons. Therefore, keeping a thick, sweaty layer of summer grime on your skin was heavily promoted as an excellent protective shield. In the middle of sweltering heat waves, citizens deliberately chose to smell completely awful just to appease the paranoid health board. 49. Working up a sweat wasn't just discouraged, it was treated as a genuine public health hazard. Magistrates officially banned popular street games, early forms of football, and tennis. The medical consensus confidently warned that physical exertion forced the body's pores to open wide, practically inviting the invisible disease inside. Citizens were legally instructed to sit completely still and avoid any strenuous activity at all costs. All right, we have covered 49 historical disasters, and only one final item remains. But before we reveal number 50, it is time for the final verdict. In our opinion, the award for the absolute most absurd regulation from today's list goes to the aggressive ban on human emotions. Criminalizing grief just because a politician thought crying disturbed the atmosphere perfectly captures the sheer, zero-logic panic of medieval authorities. Do you agree with our verdict? Or did another bizarre mandate earn that honor? Let us know below. And now, our final number. 50. Grave robbers accidentally invented one of the only effective plague defenses, and it eventually became unofficial law. Four Thieves vinegar was a powerful mixture of garlic, herbs, and vinegar used by criminals to avoid catching the disease while looting infected corpses. Once authorities caught them, they forced the thieves to reveal the secret recipe. Suddenly, citizens were practically bathing in this pungent concoction before going outside. Criminals inadvertently provided better medical advice than the elite royal doctors. The ultimate takeaway here is that when people get scared, common sense completely flies right out the window. We survived the pandemic, but the medieval laws were on a whole different level of crazy. Be honest with me. How many days could you actually survive trapped in a house completely cut off from the internet and modern technology? Let me know in the comments, smash that subscribe button, and stay tuned for more stories.